Onesimus's resolve was made more difficult by the fact that Philemon's friendship with Polemon came to an abrupt end. A few days after the party from Ephesus had arrived, Polemon came over to talk business and inquire about the guilds. Philemon explained that he had not been able to join the guilds. How could he, as a Christian, take part in their feasts and eat the food offered to idols and bind himself to the brotherhood by sacrificing to gods? He talked to Polemon about Christ, and this very greatly offended the rich merchant. He left the house quickly, saying he desired no hospitality from a lunatic and would inquire at the Laodicean medical school about a potion for brain fever. But he continued to buy Philemon's wool because it was the best in the valley. All through the hot, fruitful days, Philemon attended to his harvesting, and Epaphras remained in Colossus. Onesimus ran between the threshing floor, the winepress, the olive yards, and Archippus. But although Archippus longed for his strong young companionship more than ever, he did not need him as before. For one thing, he had learned to walk with a crutch and was becoming quite independent, and for another, his mother and little Pascasia competed with each other to wait on him hand and foot. Also, he had started to study the Jewish scriptures and was already beginning to take his place as a preacher. For night after night, when the work of the day was finished and the dusk had fallen, the people began to arrive, stealing up from the town and in from the pastures, and a strangely assorted crowd would gather in the atrium. Shepherds and reapers smelling in the flocks and the fields, tired slaves, women and little children, dignified merchants, and a group of exiled Jews. Among these were 2 or 3 keen-eyed rabbis with their Pentateuchs and scrolls of history tucked under their arms. These had been but old stories of dead men and but revered words from the past until they had suddenly discovered Christ blazing out from every parchment. Now, night after night, they pored over them, tracing the signs of his coming, reading new, living interpretations into words that had hitherto been dead. The slaves and the laborers and the mothers would soon slip out, overcome by sleep and much learning, but Philemon, Epaphras, and the rabbis would sometimes continue until the stars paled. There was little opposition at that time. Everyone was too busy getting in the harvests. The rabbis were excommunicated from their synagogues for teaching heresy and consorting with unclean Gentiles, but they felt drawn to unclean Gentiles and did not greatly care. Philemon was highly respected in the town and was left to do as he pleased. But from other cities, where Epaphras had preached the gospel and founded small churches, there came rumors of persecution and fear of death. "The olives are in," said Epaphras to Philemon, as they sat one noonday enjoying the golden autumn sunlight. "The harvests are stored. I should like you to come with me on my trip north and encourage and exhort our suffering brethren." "And who will care for the church here?" asked Philemon. Epaphras's gaze rested thoughtfully on Archippus, who was sitting a little way apart, struggling with his longing to go too. "I think you, Archippus, could start to undertake that ministry with the help of the rabbis," he said. "You are young, but the Lord is giving you much light." "Me?" Archippus looked up, flushed with pleasure at the older man's words. "But, Master Epaphras, I know so little yet." "The Holy Spirit shall teach you all things, and bring to your remembrance what you have learned," quoted Epaphras. "These were the very words of Jesus, and you have the scriptures. Now take heed to your ministry." He smiled at the amazed boy and turned back to Philemon, and Onesimus, clearing away the meal, pricked up his ears. "We will pass by Laodicea," he said, "for the Christians meeting in the house of Nymphas are mostly rich, prosperous, and respected, and seem to need no help. In Hierapolis they are firmly grounded in the faith. In Philadelphia they stand fast, but in Sardis they are in danger of being defiled. The streets of that city flow with gold, and the vice and loose living and shame that prevail are unbelievable. I pray God they will keep their garments white. In Thyatira they have been excluded from the trade guilds and are in deep poverty. But in Pergamos and Smyrna, where Caesar is worshipped and the sacrifice to Nero is compulsory, they are in daily danger of losing their lives. Yes, I must be off. I should like to start tomorrow at daybreak." So next day the 2 men started off together down the valley, staves in hand, their bundles on their backs, without slaves or attendants, and Apphia and Archippus took over the direction of the household. Onesimus in the meantime began to scheme and plan for a day's escape at whatever cost, when suddenly fate played into his hands. Pascasia had been playing out in the field, picking berries in the hedges, and had rubbed her eyes with some poisonous juice. She came in crying, her eyes sore and inflamed, and by evening she could hardly see. Apphia was deeply anxious. "Aramis must go over to Laodicea early tomorrow morning," she said, "and buy some of the Laodicean eye salve. Go and tell him to start before daybreak, Onesimus, and give him the money." Onesimus stopped outside the house to consider. He had wild thoughts of attacking Aramis, tripping him up, or knocking him senseless. but after a moment or two he decided that persuasion was better than force. He darted home and took the smallest of his precious coins from its hiding place and sought out Aramis, who was busy cleaning the stables. "Aramis," he began, holding out the coin, "look what I will give you to be ill tomorrow." Aramis stared at him, and his rather stupid mouth fell open. Then he stared at the coin. "Where did you get that from?" he asked suspiciously. "Never you mind. I earned it at Ephesus. I will buy you a basin of honey to make you fatter, Hermes, but you've got to be too ill to go to Laodicea tomorrow. I want to go instead." Hermes stared doubtfully at the impudent young cockerel hopping about, impatient at the older man's stupidity. Hermes was fat and lazy and hated being sent to Laodicea. Besides, he had not possessed a coin for years, but he was not sure that he knew how to be ill, for he had never been ill in his life. "Scream, Aramis," urged Onesimus. "Vomit. Say you've overeaten and groan as loud as you can. They'll all believe that. By the time they discover the truth, I shall be halfway down the hill." "And I shall be beaten," muttered Aramis, but the sight of the coin was so attractive, and the prospect of a 20-mile walk so unattractive, that he agreed to the plan without much more ado. Besides, he suddenly remembered that Philemon was away, and Apphia disliked beatings. Onesimus took no chances. He started off in the dark long before sunrise, while the household was still asleep, merely leaving a message that as Hermes had been very ill in the night, he, Onesimus, had gone instead. He could hardly believe his good fortunes as he dipped down over the edge of the first plain, and the farm disappeared from view. He was safe and away, and no one could stop him now. He leapt and sang like a young mad thing, for was he not free for a whole day, and was he not going to see the child of the canyons? In his elation he never even considered the possibility of failure or the extreme unlikelihood of a slave managing to speak with a high-born, carefully guarded little lady like Irene. Nothing could fail today. The sun rose as he crossed the lower plateau, but the season of burning heat was over, and its rays warmed and cheered him. All around him were golds and silvers, deep gold poplars and walnut trees and pale gold empty cornfields with their stubble and baked earth, silver of stripped olive trees and silver in the sunlight, the river below him. The miles seemed to be rolling away, and it was still fresh morning when he reached the gates of Laodicea and passed inside its fortifications. It seemed to him an enormous, magnificent city, almost an equal with Ephesus. And certainly Laodicea was a fine city. Destroyed by an earthquake 40 years before, it had been rebuilt in modern style with wide streets, 3 fine new theaters, and a gymnasium. It was the seat of all banking arrangements for Asia and notoriously wealthy, for it was also the center for the wool industry, and the clothes and fabrics woven in the Laodicean factories were exported all over the empire. Onesimus went straight to the apothecary, who lived in the shadow of the great medical school, and bought a box of the tephra phrygia, the world-famous eye powder of Laodicea. Then, his errand accomplished, he started off to find Irene's home. This was not difficult. The weavers in the cloth factories all knew Polemon, and one pointed out his great marble mansion up on the hill by the Hierapolis gate. Only when he reached the outer portals and saw the beautiful house, enclosed in an acre of garden, did he begin to realize how foolish he had been to imagine he could ever reach her. But he could not, he would not, give up. If he could just get a little nearer to the house! A bold idea struck him, and he marched up to the door with his head held high. "Master Philemon of Colossus sends greetings to Master Polemon of Laodicea," he announced firmly to the slave at the portal, "and begs to inform him that the next bale of wool will soon be dispatched. He would also have news of his health and the health of his daughter, the mistress Irene." "Tell him," said the slave, "that Master Polemon has ridden to Thyatira to buy purple dye, but he will be back in 2 days' time. He and his daughter both prosper and are in good health." Well, there was nothing to do now but to turn around and go away. But if Polemon was not at home, he could take his time. He wandered slowly toward the gate, looking back over his shoulder at the great house, and then suddenly, as he glanced toward the garden, he saw her, crouching on the ground under a mulberry tree, gathering mulberries into a basket. As before, he saw her a full minute before she saw him, and he noticed that she had changed very little. She was still slender, although probably taller, and her dark hair still fell loose about her face and shoulders. But there was a grave, lonely air about her, and when she stood up to reach the great twisted bow, she looked strangely small and fragile. All his shyness left him. He threw caution to the winds and sped over the grass toward her. She looked up quickly, and all her gravity disappeared. She knew him instantly, and her face dimpled into a delightful smile. "Have you not forgotten me, Mistress Irene?" he asked her. How could she ever forget him? Had he not been the hero of the one and only adventure she had ever had in her dull, lonely little life? Since the death of her mother, the days had all been exactly alike. The correct program of meals, lessons, embroidery, and a well-protected walk or an hour's play in the garden. But at night, when she lay in bed and had bidden her correct nurse a correct good night, and had said what she was expected to say to her father, her thoughts would fly back to the canyon at Colosse, and half asleep and half awake she would go climbing on with the boy to where flowers of unimaginable beauty bent their heads to bright streams. Sometimes the path was too steep for her or the boulders too high, and then the boy would give her his hand and help her, and it was always more beautiful further on. They never go to the top, not even in her dreams, but one day together they would look over the other side. So she studied and did as she was told, and stayed where she should, and everyone called her a good obedient little maid. But her spirit lived in another country, where the streams were cold, and the rocks were high, and the snows not far away, and no one had ever followed her there, except the boy who was always with her. And here he was again, and she was not dreaming. He was taller and thinner, his face a little more angular, but not really changed. He was looking at her in just the same way, with the same merry light of adventure in his eyes. To her it did not matter at all that he was a slave, but she knew that other people did not share her opinions, and she looked anxiously towards the house. "Come to the herb garden," she said quickly, taking his hand, just as she had taken it in the canyon. "Down there, behind these cypress trees, no one can see us, and if my governess comes you can get behind the bushes." They sat down together among the sweet-smelling herbs and shrubs, where the sun was hot and golden, and the bees hummed in and out of the bushes, and smiled delightedly at each other. "Do you remember that deep pool where you found me?" she asked, as though it had happened yesterday. "And do you remember how cross my nurse was? My father sent her away because she let me get lost, and I was glad, because she was never kind to me. Now I have a governess, and that is much better. She does not care much what I do, as long as I finish my lessons and stay in the garden." "I had hoped you would come over to Colosse again," said Onesimus, "and we might have escaped up the canyon. Do you remember how that slave of yours hit me? It was well worth it." "We shall not come again," said Irene, suddenly grown grave and thoughtful. "My father would not take me the last time he went there, because I had run away that day, and he came back very angry indeed. He said your master had become a Christian, and he thought he must have lost his senses. I heard him telling Master Molasses, his chief weaver, about it. Onesimus, have you become a Christian? Are you all Christians?" "Not I," said Onesimus. "I want to have nothing to do with it. It seems a weak sort of religion to me, forgiving your enemies and being content with your lot. I want to fight and revenge wrong, and I want to save up and be a free man when I am older." His eyes were flashing, and she looked at him, puzzled. Then she said hesitantly, "But it makes people so kind. My father does not know, but we have an old shepherd who is Christian. He worships with the people who collect in Master Nymphus's house. He and his wife live in a cottage not far from the Syrian gate where the pastures slope down to the river, and he tends my father's flock. Sometimes on my walks with Claudia, my slave, we go there. Claudia likes to look at the shops, so she leaves me in the cottage with old Euphron and Antonia. They are different from other people. They are so kind. And Antonia tells me stories about their God, Christ, how he touched a terrible leper and healed him, and took a little dead girl by the hand and she lived, and called the children to him when everyone else was bidding them be gone." "Irene," said Onesimus, half teasing, "I believe you are almost a Christian yourself." "No," said Irene slowly. "My father would not allow me to be one. He would be angry if I even spoke of it. And yet, when I hear about this Christ, sometimes I feel that I love him. Did Artemis or Cybele or our own God of healing, Asclepius, ever say, 'Let the little children come to me'? I think only Christ ever said that." The bright color had flooded her cheeks as she spoke, for she had never told anyone else these thoughts, and Onesimus knew she was showing him her inmost lonely heart. He sat very still, hardly daring to move or speak, lest he should spoil this clear moment of truth and perfect understanding. If it lasted, perhaps he too would show her all that was in his heart. "Mistress Irene! Mistress Irene!" She jumped up and peered round the bushes, and he crouched low. Then she turned back. "It is all right," she said. "Claudia is walking the other way. She will not come here, but I must go. Wait till I am in the house, and then run behind those cypress trees to the gate. You can slip out quite easily." Then she hesitated. "How did you say good-bye to the boy who was always there in your own country at the top of the canyons?" Suddenly the light of a happy memory broke across her face. "We shall meet again," she said. "Do you remember we said that last time? And we have." "Of course I remember. replied Onesimus. How could I ever forget? Ye gods, wasn't your nurse cross? They both laughed, and she tossed back her hair and turned to run across the lawn. Peace, peace, little Mistress Irene, he called softly after her. One day we shall most certainly meet again.